Imagine waking up to find the very street you've lived on your whole life suddenly claimed by the HOA. Overnight, signs went up, rules were enforced, and neighbors who once waved from their porches were now towing cars and handing out fines like they owned the place. For one homeowner, it wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a complete invasion of freedom. But instead of backing down, they decided to fight back in a way no one saw coming. What happens when a community's power trip collides with a resident who refuses to be controlled? When Mark and his family first moved into Willow Creek, it felt like the perfect place to settle down. Tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes until sunset, and neighbors who smiled as they walked their dogs. It was the picture of small-town comfort. Their home wasn't the biggest on the block, but had everything they needed: a quiet backyard, space for Mark's weekend projects, and just enough distance from the city to finally breathe. For a while, life really was good. Cookouts with friends, birthday parties in the driveway, late-night conversations on the porch. It felt like a community that cared about each other. At least, that's how it seemed at first. But behind the manicured lawns and cheerful greetings, there was a different current running through Willow Creek. The HOA wasn't just enforcing rules. It was creating them out of thin air. And little by little, those rules were creeping closer to Mark's front door. First, it was about what color his fence could be. Then, where his truck was allowed to park. Each notice came with the same smug tone, as if the board believed they owned more than just the common spaces. Mark brushed it off, telling himself it wasn't worth the fight. After all, wasn't that the price of living in a nice neighborhood? But what he didn't know then was that the HOA had much bigger plans. Plans that would turn his quiet street into a battleground. And when those plans finally landed on his doorstep, they didn't just threaten his property. They threatened his entire way of life. Then came the night he knew things had gone too far. Mark was hosting a small get-together in his backyard. Nothing wild, just family and close friends. But halfway through, a security guard hired by the HOA appeared at his gate. The man held a clipboard and a warning slip. Mark's gathering was a noise violation. At 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening, Mark's kids saw it all. They saw the guard standing there like an enforcer, treating their father like a criminal on his own property. That humiliation burned deeper than any fine. From that moment, the fight stopped being about money. It became about principle, about freedom. Then came the night he knew things had gone too far. Mark was hosting a small get-together in his backyard. Nothing wild, just family and close friends. But halfway through, a security guard hired by the HOA appeared at his gate. The man held a clipboard and a warning slip. Mark's gathering was a noise violation. At 9 o'clock on a Saturday evening, Mark's kids saw it all. They saw the guard standing there like an enforcer, treating their father like a criminal on his own property. That humiliation burned deeper than any fine. From that moment, the fight stopped being about money. It became about principle, about freedom. One afternoon, he returned home to find stakes in the ground, cutting across the edge of his yard. When he called the board to ask what was happening, they calmly informed him that common property adjustments were underway, and part of his yard was no longer his. It was like a slow-motion invasion. A few feet here, a new rule there. They were carving away at his home piece by piece. Mark fought back the only way he knew how: paperwork. He filed complaints, requested records, demanded to see bylaws. But each time, the HOA stonewalled him. "We'll look into it. It's under review." Weeks passed, and the rules kept piling up. He began digging deeper. He pored over HOA meeting notes, tracked every rule change, and even spoke with a lawyer. That's when the truth surfaced. The HOA was quietly maneuvering to claim control over the very road in front of his house, a private stretch that technically belonged to the residents, but which the board was trying to absorb into their jurisdiction. If they succeeded, Mark wouldn't just be fighting over fines and paint colors. He'd be losing access to the street he drove every single day. And worse, the HOA would have the power to ticket, tow, and fine anyone who dared to step out of line. Neighbors didn't believe it at first. They'd never go that far, one man told him. But when the official notice arrived in the mail, stamped with the board's seal, the entire neighborhood went silent. The HOA wasn't bluffing. The road would be theirs, unless someone stopped them. Mark tried to rally his neighbors. Some supported him, but many were too afraid. "We can't risk it," they said. "The board will just come down harder." The divide left him isolated, fighting not just the HOA, but the apathy of those around him. Meanwhile, the harassment only intensified. His mailbox was stuffed with fines. His truck was ticketed again, despite being parked in the same spot for years. And then, one morning, he walked outside to find tire tracks slashed into his lawn, a clear message that someone, somewhere, wanted him to give up. But he didn't. Instead, Mark started planning, watching, waiting. He realized that if the board wanted a battle over control, they were going to get one. Only this time, he wouldn't be on the defensive, because Mark had discovered something about the HOA, a weakness buried in their own arrogance. And if he played it right, he wouldn't just stop them. He'd bring their entire operation crashing down in front of everyone. The question was, could he risk it all to take them on? The night before the vote, Mark barely slept. By morning, his driveway was littered with new notices, overdue fines, threats of property liens, even a final warning about his truck. The HOA had gone all in, betting on intimidation to keep him quiet. But Mark wasn't backing down. The clubhouse was packed that evening. Folding chairs lined the walls, every seat filled with anxious neighbors, some clutching HOA paperwork like it was a summons to court. At the front sat the board, polished, smug, shuffling their papers as though victory was already sealed. Their plan was simple: finalize control of the road, cement their authority, and silence anyone who dared resist. When the president called the meeting to order, the air felt like it could snap. He droned on about community standards and necessary oversight, glossing over the fact that what they were really doing was stripping residents of property they legally owned. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one raised a hand. No one, except Mark. He stood. The room quieted. His voice didn't tremble, though his chest was pounding. "Before you take this vote," he said, "everyone here deserves to know the truth." The president smirked, waving him off. "Mr. Daniels, this isn't the time." But Mark didn't sit down. Instead, he reached into his folder and laid a thick stack of documents on the table. "These are the HOA's own records," he said, loud enough for the back row to hear. "And they prove that what this board is doing isn't just unfair. It's illegal." Gasps scattered across the room. The board shuffled nervously. Mark went on. He explained how the HOA had quietly rewritten rules without majority approval, how they diverted community funds to pay for personal expenses, how their attempt to seize the road violated not only the bylaws, but also county property law. Each page, each highlighted line, was a nail in the coffin of their authority. The president's face flushed crimson. "This is outrageous." "No," Mark cut in, his voice rising. "What's outrageous is watching neighbors find into silence. Kids grow up thinking their family doesn't belong, and hardworking people treated like criminals on their own property. You think you're untouchable because you hide behind paperwork. But today, everyone sees exactly who you are." The room erupted. Some neighbors cheered, others shouted questions. For the first time, the board looked rattled. Their confidence cracked as Mark revealed the final blow, a letter from his attorney, already filed with the county, demanding a full investigation into the HOA's practices and threatening personal liability for every board member involved. The president slammed his gavel, trying to restore order, but it was too late. The tide had turned. Neighbors who once stayed silent were now on their feet, demanding accountability, shouting over the board's desperate attempts to regain control. Years of fear and frustration boiled over in one explosive moment. And then, the unforgettable twist. As Mark packed up his papers, the HOA's own treasurer, a weary-looking man who had been silent through most meetings, suddenly stood and spoke. His voice shook as he admitted that Mark was right, that funds had been misused, that votes had been falsified, that he couldn't keep quiet anymore. The crowd went still. Every eye in the room locked on the board as the treasurer confirmed everything Mark had said. In that instant, the authority the board had lorded over the community shattered like glass. For Mark, it was vindication, but it was also rage, grief, and relief all at once. He had fought for months, endured humiliation, harassment, and isolation, and now, here it was lay bare for everyone to see. The president, red-faced and sputtering, tried one last time to push the vote through. "We still have the authority to decide." "No," Mark shot back, his voice cutting clean through the chaos. "You had the authority. Now you're finished." The room thundered with applause. Neighbors who had been too afraid to take sides now stood shoulder to shoulder, shouting down the board, demanding resignations. What had started as one man's battle had become a full-scale revolt. Mark walked out of that meeting knowing the fight wasn't over. Not yet. Legal proceedings would take time. The board wouldn't vanish overnight. But the spell had been broken. The HOA no longer ruled with fear. And as he stepped into the cool night air, the weight of months lifted from his chest. One thought echoed louder than all the cheers behind him. They picked the wrong man to push around. In the weeks that followed the explosive meeting, the ripple effects spread through Willow Creek like wildfire. The county investigator moved quickly after receiving Mark's attorney's letter, issuing subpoenas for the HOA's financial records and freezing their authority to enact new rules until the probe was complete. For the first time in years, the board's power was not only questioned, it was stripped away piece by piece. Neighbors who had once cowered under the threat of fines suddenly found their voices. The couple down the street, fined for planting unapproved flowers, replanted them proudly, this time with twice as many. Families began parking where they pleased, flags and holiday lights reappeared on porches, and laughter returned to backyards that had once gone quiet under constant surveillance. Mark watched all of it with a mix of pride and disbelief. He hadn't asked to become the face of resistance, but his fight had lit a spark no one else had dared strike. Suddenly, he was the man neighbors approached at the mailbox, not to whisper warnings, but to thank him, sometimes with shaky voices, sometimes with tears. For so long, they had all lived in fear. Now, that fear was broken. But the consequences for the HOA leadership were just beginning. Within a month, the treasurer formally resigned and handed over documents that confirmed misuse of community funds. Thousands of dollars funneled into administrative expenses that were, in reality, lavish dinners, vacations, and home improvement for certain board members. The president, once untouchable, was summoned to court. His smug grin, so constant in every meeting, vanished the day he was served. The legal case dragged on for months, but for Mark, every update was a small victory. Each revelation confirmed what he already knew. The HOA had never been about protecting the neighborhood. It had been about power, greed, and control. And now, stripped bare, the board was nothing more than a cautionary tale. Still, the victory wasn't just in the courtroom. The residents of Willow Creek held a special election, and for the first time, candidates who truly wanted to serve the community, not dominate it, stepped forward. Mark didn't run. He didn't need to. His fight had never been about gaining authority. It had been about restoring balance, about proving that no one should live under the boot of intimidation in their own home. The new board's first act was to overturn dozens of oppressive rules. They reinstated freedoms the old board had crushed, refunded fines that had been wrongfully collected, and pledged transparency by opening every meeting to the public. What had once been a hollow formality turned into real community conversations. People felt heard again. For Mark and his family, the difference was night and day. No more early morning walks to the mailbox filled with dread. No more fearing what notice or threat might appear next. His children played in the yard without worry. His truck sat proudly in the driveway, and his weekends were filled with the simple joys he had fought so hard to protect. Yet perhaps the most powerful impact wasn't in the rules that changed, but in the spirit of the neighborhood itself. Where fear had once divided neighbors, unity now bound them together. Block parties returned, this time louder and livelier than ever, as though each gathering was a quiet celebration of freedom reclaimed. And when new families moved in, they were welcomed not with suspicion but with warmth, and often with a whispered story about the man who had stood up when no one else dared. Mark learned something too. He realized that standing alone is never truly alone, because courage has a way of drawing others out of the shadows. It took months of battles, endless frustration, and sleepless nights, but the moment he refused to back down, The tide had already started turning. Looking back, he sometimes wondered what would have happened if he had just paid the fines, stayed quiet, let the board take what it wanted. Maybe life would have been easier in the short term. But every time he drove down that street, the street the HOA had once tried to claim as their own, he knew silence would have cost far more. The board members who abused their power faced their reckoning in court. Some paid fines of their own. Others were barred from serving on any HOA again, and their reputations, once so carefully polished, were permanently stained. Their downfall wasn't swift, but it was complete. And Willow Creek? It thrived, freed from the chokehold of pettiness and corruption. The neighborhood became what it had always promised to be, a place where families could live, laugh, and grow without fear of who was watching or what letter might show up in their mailbox. In the end, Mark's battle wasn't just about his yard, his truck, or even his road. It was about a principle that no group, no matter how official it sounds, has the right to strip people of dignity in their own homes. And as he sat on his porch one evening, watching the sun dip low and neighbors wave as they passed by, he thought about the long months of struggle, the humiliation, the anger, the exhaustion. Then he looked at his family, his home, his street, still his, and he smiled. Because sometimes the only way to protect your peace is to fight for it. And when you do, you don't just change your own life. You change an entire community. So the next time someone asks whether one person can make a difference against something as relentless as an HOA, the answer is simple. Ask Willow Creek.